there's my mask. And they play tonight. They're on national TV. I never get to watch them because they are so bad. So they hardly ever get on TV in this area, and so they're on TV tonight, but I'm here. Glad to be here though too, in all seriousness. Can this tilt?
Yeah, loosen it to the left there.
Here we go. So, when you watch these stories, guys, I want to start by saying a big, big thank you. When you see a story like this, I'm going to tell a story here in a minute that I think illustrates who we are and what we do. It's a powerful story that really, it just talks about, I think, the community that we are. One of the things that the factory is built upon is when you step out to take on things that are worth taking on. Affordable housing is a big, big nut to crack. I mean, how do you do it? Where do you even start with that? Food insecurity, poverty, education. When you look at the stuff in our country and in our community that you say, man, how do we help people in this area? One of the things that we passionately believe with all of our heart is that not one single organization has what it takes to get that thing done. Not one. Even education. Take education, for example. When you talk to Factory Valley, you saw Rich Eby in the video. When you talk to Rich Eby or Eric Gorndorf, our superintendent and assistant superintendent, they're all about education, but they will look at you in the eyes and say, we don't have what it takes to truly accomplish and do what's required of us in education. We've got to learn to work together. It's just such a beautiful picture then when we do. And I want to talk about, share a story. So you guys in donating your food, I cannot say thank you enough for that. People like Shannon are receiving that food. So let me share a story that talks about our food and what happened this past year with COVID. I think really illustrates this working together. And then I'll share from the scriptures some of what kind of motivates me as the leader of the factory. I was a pastor for 9 years, so I'll kind of weave some of that into the story that really brought me to where I'm at and how I see serving those that are under-resourced. March 13th of this past year, it was my anniversary. 21 years of marriage. I had to stop it. 21 years of marriage. My wife and I were thrilled. We're excited. We had made plans. We had just moved. Took the job. I've been at the factory now a year and like 4 months. And so we had moved. We were actually living up in Terry Hill, and so we wanted to get closer to this area. So the housing market right still to this day, even with COVID, is so tough. And like, how do we get into this area? How do we move? So we finally land a house during the Christmas season. I think that's how we ended up with some of it, because who moves during Christmas? So we bought a house, put an offering during Christmas. The whole thing goes through. We decide to move then. We settle the very last week of February. We move into the house. We work with a contractor to do some work to get it set up for our family. We have 4 kids. And we're like, hey, my wife and I are all busy, like, let's take a trip for our anniversary. It's been such a crazy winter, let's take a trip. Now, COVID was in the news. February, began to hear about it. You heard about it coming into Washington, coming into California, you heard about China. In my mind, I'm old enough, I'm in my 40s, that I remember a lot of these type of things. I think many of you do. I mean, you remember SARS, and you remember all these different viruses that come. So I'm like, So my wife and I, let's go do this. We're getting closer and closer. On March 13th, as we're getting ready to leave, our kids go to Garden Spot High School. We live right over the line here in Factory Valley. And Garden Spot, Factory Valley, Ephrata, every school, I think just about every school district here in Lancaster said, we're shutting down for at least 2 weeks. My wife and I are like, do we go away? Like there's like this big thing happening? Do we just abandon our kids and say, see ya? In my mind, I'm like, let's do it. I mean, let's make it happen. And this kind of shows, I don't know about you, when you go back to that place in March, I could not fathom what we've experienced over the last, 8 months. It just blown my mind. I was thinking this will come and go. It's not, well, we know it wasn't. On March 13th, then, as we're getting ready to leave, I take a phone call from Kathy Koenig at Factory Valley. She is the director of student ministry, Director of Student Services at Peckley Valley. And she says to us, hey Adam, we're shutting down for 2 weeks and we're trying to figure out what to do with school lunches. Can we shift it to your property? Right away said yes. Now again, I want to illustrate, we have this, you saw in the video, Tim Rogers, and it just starts with how can we help? Tim, years earlier, sat down with the executive director of the factory, went to the school, went to the township, went to the Boy Scouts, went to anyone in the community, and just simply with the question, Jesse mentioned earlier, love your neighbor, love God, love your neighbor, just simply went and said, how can we help? How can we help? So enough of this had happened where the factory just continued to grow, and so these relationships are forming, and so the fruit of all this hard work over years and years is now this really tight relationship with the school district, to the point where they call us, can we bring you the free and reduced lunches? Yes, let's do it. So they come over, and you guys all kind of know the story. COVID hits, everything shuts down. It wasn't just a 2-week deal, it was a 2-month deal. Things got chaotic, it was scary, it was what's going on. So at the factory, we're like, okay, we now have these school lunches, and we committed to being more accessible than ever. We're like, okay, in a pandemic, when crisis hits, if anyone is needed right now, we are needed. So let's get on the front lines. We began to roll our sleeves up, and we were absolutely flooded in the first month. We jumped 200 families in our food program, just like that, in the first couple weeks. So I thought, well, this is normal. This is how COVID works. This is how this is what's happening. But I began to talk to CrossNet in New Holland. I talked to Real Life in Denver, Solanco, Family Life. There's a lot of ministries like the factory all around the county. And I heard, different reports. Like, yeah, we really prepared for an uptick, but we only really saw about 20 to 30 new families. I heard another one say, we really prepared for an uptick, and we really only saw about 3 or 4 new families. And I'm sitting here in my office going, what in the world? We saw 200 families. What is it? So I circled back and I began to ask the question of these others. Can I ask you guys, the free and reduced lunch, did you bring it onto your property? Across the board, it was a no. I was like, this is it. Here's, again, illustrate what the factory does. So you watch the video of Shannon. And a lot of times we think of stories, that's who the factory serves really well. Right now the poverty threshold in America is at I want to say it's like $27 some odd thousand. If you make below that in your household, you are considered in poverty in our American system. Free and reduced lunch, you can get free and reduced lunch for a family my size making $55,000. Now, when you look at it, well, $55,000 is a pretty good amount of money, but when you really begin to add it up, you add up what housing costs, you add up all of the expenses of having 4 kids, you add up and you think, well, 55, yeah, it is pretty tight, it's really tight. But a family making $55,000 often doesn't show up at the factory because they self-resolve, it's a different mindset at times, from 20-some thousand to 55,000. But what ended up happening with the school lunches, guess who was showing up at the factory? People making $55,000. Now, what you heard in this is we take a view of poverty that is not simply financial. We look at poverty as simply being under-resourced, and you can be under-resourced emotionally, you can be under-resourced relationally, you can be under-resourced spiritually, you can be under-resourced financially, intellectually. You can be under-resourced. So we don't take this approach of, you're in poverty, you need something, come to us, we'll help you. We look at this just under-resourced. So here we have these families making $55,000 showing up at our front door to get school lunches for their kids. And then we're able to say to them, hey, we're here to walk with you. Boom, they're walking with us. But a lot of it forms out of those relationships that happen with the school. We're not in this alone. We are a community. The food in the back of your truck is going to help support. We couldn't do 200 extra families without significant support. We've had 5 Food Fridays that have been under 1,000 pounds of food in 33 weeks, 32 weeks right now. Which, when you stop and think about that, it's just staggering how we work together. So that's really kind of what the factory is. I want to come around to the start of the factory, and then I want to read some scripture to you. In 1994, two churches, how all this happened, two churches came together and said, well, we noticed there's a lot of teenagers in our community, and the terms they used at the time was at risk, that we're not reaching. What can we do to reach them? So they came up with this idea, why don't we create like a drop-in center for teenagers? So they pulled their team together and they said, let's do it. They had this old building that was an old sewing factory, hence the term. Everyone always says, where did that name come from? It's an old sewing factory right off of Lincoln Highway, Route 30 over in Paradise. So they begin to grow. A couple things begin to surface. One thing they realized, well, kids graduate at some point and move on. So what happens when they move on? Where's their support? Where are the resources? How do we walk with a child or a teenager who's now graduated and moving on from our program? And more than that, what's true of every one of us in this room, you may not realize it, and anyone online, but you will realize it at some point if you haven't already. That is, our idiosyncrasies, the things that those around us that sometimes people get frustrated with us, the stuff that we struggle in, often is related to the family in which we were planted. It's just kind of a reality of life. And so we realized, the fact was they're in the 90s, like if we're going to help teens, we've really got to help mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, whoever the guardian is, the family system around them. So the idea was birthed to let's have, in essence, social workers. We call them advocates, case workers, case managers, to come alongside of these families. So therefore, the social service end of the factory was born. That begins to grow. Ultimately, the factory stands on that we are here to support the local church. It's a passion of ours, and so this was birthed in a church. It was not a thing that says, hey, we're going to come and take this from the church. So these social workers are coming to walk alongside of the local church and to resource, etc. So it's growing. In the meantime, some of the local churches are getting together. You saw Tim Rogers on the screen, and they start sitting down and say, how can we be a good neighbor? How can we be a good neighbor? So they start with this question. They end up with the school district, and they say to the school district, if we could give you 2,000 man-hours and $25,000, what could you do with it? This creates this conversation. They end up traveling there. They go out to Seattle. Rich Eby, the assistant superintendent, Tim Rogers, the executive director of the factory, and some other staff fly out to Seattle to look at a guy. I don't know if you're familiar with Luis Palau. He's on WJTL, I think still here. He has a little clip. His son, Kevin Palau, has a ministry in Seattle where churches and public schools get together. So they go out to study this and figure out, okay, how does this thing work? And so on the flight back, the assistant superintendent, who you saw there, Rich Eby, says to Tim and Chuck, the executive director at the time, they says, hey, listen, that $25,000 thing, were you guys serious? And they're like, yes, we're serious. Like, what could you do with it? So they begin to dream, and they begin to realize in Pequea Valley, a couple things are true of this school district. Over 50% of the students are on free and reduced lunch. When you hear that, you're like, really? You don't see it when you drive around here, but over 50%. We're the third. We're in Lancaster County. We are number 3 on the list for percentage of students on free and reduced lunch. So it's a high poverty school district. The other thing that's true, last school year, we saw 43, I believe it was, low 40s, kids that were coded homeless. Students at Pequea Valley who were coded homeless. There's a significant amount of revenue. During this conversation, this is what's really cool. During this conversation, at the time, when they're flying back from Seattle, Pequea Valley School District was ranked at we were second from the bottom on kindergarten readiness. The IU13 has the kindergarten readiness score. We were ranked second from the bottom. So Rich is realizing if you're going to conquer poverty, one of the things that's absolutely crucial is those early years. Education is a really big deal. If to get a child to come into kindergarten ready, ahead of the game, they don't then lag behind, and they ultimately succeed. The statistics are staggering. So we're like, well, we got to plug in kindergarten readiness. So we, the plan was hatched. The church and the factories say, well, you know, we're going to let's pay for a position and gift it to the school district. This begins to catch fire. Our kindergarten readiness scores are now consistently in the top 5 in the county. It's produced. Community Action Partners, CAP, steps in and says, hey, we actually have a position similar to this position we're going to gift you. So then we've got another. So we've got these now 2 shared positions, and it just starts to really grow. At the time, United Way is shifting their funding model to be a collective impact, which is they're looking at saying, if you're really going to make a difference, you've got to learn to bring organizations together to solve these problems. So they're like, well, if we're going to shift to collective impact, is there anyone doing it in the county already? Oh, there's this place out here out in farm country, out in Amish land, doing this kind of, I think they're doing it already. Why don't we just get on board with them, because they're already doing what we hope to see happen in the whole county. They come out and gave us a significant grant, which then was like dumping, I look at it like dumping rocket fuel into the rocket that got us launched. And today we now have 19 staff. 4 of those are shared staff positions, meaning they work at the factory on payroll, but they're in the school and in other places. And we are walking and serving families. It was pre-COVID, we were averaging about 180 families that were involved, engaged in social service, some kind of what you saw, Shannon's story there. That has significantly jumped through COVID. So that's kind of our story. There's a lot more to it, and I would love, I mean, a lot of times when I do this week, I always do Q&A and love to interact. But let me share the biblical heart behind this story. And I'll look at Acts, Acts chapter 15. Now this was funny. I'm standing here tonight, and I'm like, wonder where they're at right now in there. I didn't look up, so I get on, I was there looking online, and I happened to notice you're going to be in Acts 15 this Sunday. Yeah. Who's preaching that? Is that's me? There you go. So, here we go. Jesse's like, oh no, here we go. Let's see. I'm going to read one verse. Jesse will cover the whole, I didn't cover the chapter in 16 I saw when I just looked at that, right? Yeah. So he's going to cover a lot more ground than I'm going to cover. Acts 15 happens in Jerusalem. The church is young. There's a guy by the name of Apostle Paul. If you're new to the Bible at all, he's a guy who hated Jesus, anyone associated with Jesus Christ. He tried to kill everyone associated with Jesus Christ. He then meets Jesus Christ, becomes a follower of Jesus Christ, and then says, okay, let's plant churches. And he is commissioned to, God kind of sends him out to go to what we refer to as the Gentiles, which is a non-Jewish person. Again, so Jesus kind of grew up in the Jewish tradition, and now here we are moving out to fulfill what in essence Scripture has talked about all along. I mean, from the days of Abraham, who's the father of the Jewish people, it was, you're going to be a blessing to all nations. Well, the Jewish nation struggled to fulfill that. Well, Jesus comes along, and it's now being fulfilled as Paul's going out to plant churches. Well, as you can imagine, this is causing quite a stir, because you have all these Jewish customs and Jewish laws and this whole heritage and history following all the way back to Abraham. And along comes this upstart, the Apostle Paul, and he's like breaking all the rules, if you will. Up one side, down the other. They're eating pork, and they're doing all kinds of stuff. And the Jews are getting a little upset. They're like, no, wait a minute. Circumcision becomes an issue. All this stuff happens. So they call Paul into this council to rule and have a decision. Like, what are we going to do? Are we going to keep the Church of Jesus Christ Jewish, and they're wrestling and working through all this. So I just want to read you one verse. It's a powerful chapter. Jesse will do this far more justice this weekend. I'm just going to look at one verse out of this, and then I'm going to look at the backstory of it in Galatians. Acts chapter 15, verse 19. So this gets to the end of it, right? So they have this whole debate, this whole argument. Imagine all these smart theologians and church fathers and leaders, and they're all sitting around. And it says, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God." That is one of the most powerful verses for the Church of Jesus Christ, in my opinion. It says, listen, make it easy. lower the bar. I don't know what it is about church folks, myself included. I was a pastor for 9 years. I grew up in the church. I went to a Christian school. I went to a Christian college. We tend to want to raise the bar. Like, let's notch it up. Let's champion the notch it up and notch it up. And here these guys are like, hey, listen, let's recognize that there are people outside of our walls that look in here and think, what are they doing? What is this? And they decide, let's make it really easy for those people out there to get in here, in essence, is what he's saying. Let's make sure that our message isn't wrapped up in our culture. Let's make sure that our message can preach in eastern Lancaster County and it can preach in Taiwan. So it's not cultural. It's not wrapped up in laws and traditions, but it is freed, as the message of Jesus was designed to be, to go to all people and free all people. Let's lower the bar, in other words. Now, that's a powerful verse. The Church of Jesus Christ, the way I say it, is the hope of the world. That is what we are. We were given to the world. If you go anywhere in the world, there is a church. We're the hope of the world because we steward this message of Jesus Christ. It's mind-blowing, the gospel of Jesus Christ. I mean, it gives me goosebumps when I think about it. It's this free gift. It's just unbelievable. We're the hope of the world. The factory is not. This is why I'm reading this to you. It doesn't say, go start a social service agency. It says, be a church. And why I love this is because no matter where you go in the world, there's a church. I mean, no matter where you go, I think, just about. It's getting to the point where there are very few languages in the world today, people groups, that do not have groups of Jesus followers. So in my opinion, and our staff's opinion, and our board, the factory does not exist to replace the church. We exist to help the church do what it was designed to do, fully and wholeheartedly. That's why we're here. Now, Galatians, if you flip over to Galatians chapter 1 and 2 tell the backstory of Acts chapter 15. It's this funny story. You read Paul, he's nervous. I mean, some of you that know the scriptures, you think, the Apostle Paul, he's a little nervous. And he's got some anxiety, even, I would go so far as to say. And he's telling the story of how he came to know Jesus, how he spent time in the wilderness, and then he's being called to Jerusalem to go to we just looked at in Acts 15. And he's being called to come down there, and he's nervous. Now, when you really pay attention to what he's nervous about, he says it very clearly. He goes, I'm not nervous because there's Peter and John and these amazing apostles. These are like the super, it's like if I get to meet Ryan Fitzpatrick, and he's a pretty cool quarterback for the Miami Dolphins, right? Or Tua, who they just drafted. Like, I would walk into that room and I would get nervous, right? It's like, wow, like here's someone, or if it's a theologian that I look up to, or a leader that I love, I walked in and I'd start to get nervous. So Paul's saying, you think that's why Paul's nervous, because he's not one of them. He didn't live with Jesus like these guys did. But he says, that's not why I'm nervous. I'm nervous because the gospel of Jesus Christ is at stake. That's why I'm nervous. And I want to know, are these guys going to stand up and let the gospel be the gospel? Or are they going to cave to the Jewish pressure and let it be wrapped up in Jewish tradition? That's why he's nervous. So he tells the story here in Galatians. He goes down, Galatians chapter 2, start at verse 7. Actually, start at verse 6. As for those who seem to be important, I love this language, who seem to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge the external appearance. Those men added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the Jews. So see, he's saying, so they didn't change my message. These guys didn't change what I was saying. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. Here's the verse. That whole chapter is powerful. Here's the verse I wanted that focuses on the factory. All they asked was that we should continue to remember what? The poor. Now when you read Acts 15, ask Jesse after he studies Acts 15 why that doesn't show up in Acts 15. You don't read that in Acts 15. But Paul reports it that this is what he heard them say. Just take care of the poor. You're going to go do this new thing. You're going to go blaze a new trail, plant churches all over. Just please remember your priority is to take care of the poor. That has been the church's mission from day one. And what I have found as a pastor is it is really hard to do. And it pulls apart. There's this tension that forms, and you get churches on one side that forget all about serving the poor because they say, we're true to the scriptures, and our job as a church is to preach the gospel. And they become very proclamation-oriented. They're big on Bible teaching and Bible preaching. Their job is to get people together and teach them the Bible. Proclaim truth to all nations. And they do very, very little in way of caring for the poor. And then they argue that when they come to the churches that are on this side that care for the poor and social justice issues, they say, oh, this side now does all this social justice, but they've neglected the preaching of God's word. You see this debate all the time, and you end up with these churches that kind of pull apart. The factory steps in and we say, listen, both of these sides are so important. The church is called to care for the poor, and the church is called to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. I don't know why we have to pull this, let's come together. So we recognize it is our job to walk with you guys in serving the poor. It is hands down our job to do that. We also recognize that social service was not a thing until after the 1950s in America. It was always done in the church. When you study social work, if you go to college and study social work, you're going to learn that the entitlement spending programs did not happen until after World War II, until some of our Roosevelt and these guys start creating a system, which I'm not here to get political about it. Let's not say whether it's good or bad, but it happened. In a lot of ways, the church stepped back. And now care for the poor shifted to who? The government. And now the government, in the midst of all of our political stuff right now, you'll hear debates around this. And I always want to sit back and say, oh, I'm so sad. Because the church was set up to do this. And our government, I don't think, would be doing it like they are. I think they'd still have to at some capacity. But like they are, if the church had stayed engaged with exactly what Paul said, they just asked me not to neglect the care for the poor. Now, we understand at the factory why that happens is because it is such a complex system. Like, just take COVID. I'm amazed at all the law changes and the shifting and it's crazy. It's tough to navigate with someone who's been evicted. So what we're doing is we're coming along and saying, listen, you guys are walking with people in the community. We're here to help you navigate the systems to make it happen. We're here to help also make sure people aren't abusing the church. I remember as a pastor, I used to get phone calls all the time. Hi, I'm so-and-so. They give me this whole sob story. Little did I find out when I'm meeting with the pastor up the street, they got the same phone call, and these people are just moving from church to church to church to siphon money off the church because they know, hey, these people care, they've got a heart, they're going to give me money. So that's also what we do, is we help create a system of accountability and structure and empowerment. We're all about empowerment and walking with people and journeying with them and to say, hey, we're here to walk with you and care for the poor. 30 minutes, right?
However much.
I had 28:55, so I got 1 minute and a few seconds left.
Yeah,
so,
however much you need. Yeah.
Here's what I'll end with. I got a lot of things I could talk about. Here's what I'll end with. I was sitting with someone recently in the last year, and we were talking about this reality of care for the poor, and they made this statement to me, and it struck me. It absolutely struck me. He said to me, Adam, he's kind of a mentor of mine. He says, when you disconnect care for the poor from the gospel message of Jesus Christ, the gospel message of Jesus Christ becomes a very cruel message. It kind of is one of those, you ever sit with someone and they say something and it's like, it sounds profound, but it kind of goes over your head? I was driving home and I'm like, what did he say to me? So I followed back up with an email. I said, is this what you said? He said, absolutely, that's what I said. Tell me more about that. And the more he told me, I'm like, oh my word. When you walk with the poor, Jesus says they're always going to be amongst you. When you walk with the poor, what you begin to realize is the need for grace. And when you keep the gospel and serving the poor together, it leaves the gospel functioning as what it was designed to be, a message of love, grace, and no judgment. I'm amazed, one scenario, you have someone step in. Remember the brand new pastor and sitting around a table with the pastors and they're complaining because someone in their church that they were trying to help had cable TV. And they're like, if they can't pay their bills, they shouldn't have cable TV. Now that's judgment to the core. And I remember sitting there as a young pastor walking away engaged with them and the tension of it. Like, I don't know, well, I can see their point, they're wasting money in that. But then I started thinking, I'm like, what else are they going to do? I went to see the Jets and the Dolphins play in the Meadowlands last year. I have the resources to do that. I could go down the list. This past weekend, I went with my family. We went out this past year and bought bikes, outfitted our whole family in bikes, so we could go for bike rides through the COVID season. I have resources. So I'm able to do things. But when you're struggling and you're in pain and you don't know how to put one foot in front of the other, they might smoke a cigarette. Might even do a pack a day. And that's a lot of money. But when you really learn to walk with them and sit with them and listen to them and love them, as opposed to standing out here and judging them, you begin to realize, well, of course they smoke cigarettes. It's the same reason I'm on level 5,300 and something on Candy Crush. Why do I do that? Because I get to the end of a hard day and I just need to relieve some stress. Now, my vice isn't a cigarette, but I'm finding something to cope with my pain. Pain in small pain. No, I'm not talking. But so caring for the poor, truly caring for the poor, leaves you journeying these journeys. And it eradicates judgment in a hurry. You begin to see the complexity of it. You begin to understand, oh my goodness, what would I do? You begin to understand how much of our life has been handed to us. Like, I had someone pay for most of my college. When I look at that, that is a massive gift that got me way ahead in life. I had a dad who owned a business, so I had a place to work. And I made as a 16-year-old kid, he hired me to mow the lawn for the business. I made $150 a week mowing that lawn as a 16-year-old kid. So you begin to realize, oh my gosh, I have been given so much.